Good morning, my friends. I'm Pastor Ben Hayes from First Baptist Church, Dadeville, bringing you our thought for the day on what I hope is a wonderful Wednesday. I'm recording this on Tuesday because Wednesday morning I have to be at the high school bright and early for Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Pray for these kids today as they meet, and let's just trust the Lord to do an amazing work in their lives. But right now we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, picking up in verse 1. This is an interesting passage that Paul is preaching. And keep in mind here, these chapter and verse divisions, they are man-made. When Paul wrote this letter, there were no chapter divisions, no verse divisions. So he's carrying from one thought to the other, talking about the fact that we're running the race, doing the best we can, disciplining ourselves so that we can hear those wonderful words of Jesus, well done, good and faithful servant. And then he goes on in verse 1, he says, moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. Now, here's what he's saying. All of our ancestors, all of our Jewish ancestors who came out of Egypt under the leadership of Moses, they all did the same thing. They were all under the cloud, the glory cloud that led them by day, the fire that led them by night. They were all there. They all walked through the Red Sea when God parted it to deliver them from their Egyptian captors. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. In other words, he's saying that they were all made part of the community, the nation of Israel. God took them into the wilderness to get all of the Egypt out of them and put all of him into them that he could with the Ten Commandments and the offering of the law that was there. All ate the same spiritual food, the manna that God shared from heaven, the quail that God sent from heaven. All drank the same spiritual drink. Now look what he says. He says, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. You remember that story? And there's a legend, it's not in the Old Testament, that the rock that Moses struck to bring water for the people when there was no water, that rock followed them through the wilderness. That's what he's referring to here. And he's saying, look, that was a spiritual rock. That was Jesus himself, who is the water of life, who's the living water. And he that drinks of this water will never thirst again. You remember what Jesus said to the woman at the well? That's what he's talking about there. So all of the people of Israel who came out of Egypt were part of this community that were considered to be God's children. So you got that? They were all together from Moses all the way to the least in the tribes of Israel. But look at what he says in verse 5. But with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. You know what he's talking about. He's talking about those that refused to go into the promised land. Everyone over the age of 40 except for Caleb and Joshua would die in the wilderness, because they had rejected God's will to go into the promised land and to defeat the enemies and be in the land flowing with milk and honey, the land that God had provided for them. And when they rebelled against God's will, God said, I've had it, had enough. All of you adults, you're never going to see the promised land, including Moses. And so they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years until all of that generation had died. Now, you see what he's saying? God was not well pleased with most of them, and they were buried in the wilderness before they got into the promised land. See, here's what he's talking about here. The way that we live our lives is important to the Father. He's not talking about a loss of salvation. Once you are saved, you are always saved. Please know that. Understand that. Once you have made that commitment to surrender your life to Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit comes to indwell you, and that's never going to change. Now, there are times when you grieve the Spirit by doing the wrong things, quench the Spirit when you do the wrong things, but you are always going to be a child of God. But sometimes when we walk outside of his will, we are not pleasing him. And while our bodies may not be scattered in the wilderness, we find ourselves wandering in a spiritual wilderness, separated from God by our sin. Not that we've lost salvation, but separated from the fellowship of God. And it's all because we have not done what God has called us to do. It's all about obedience to the Father. And that's what Paul is reminding us of. We've got to discipline ourselves to do the right things. Now, look at verse 6. We're not going to talk about this much, but he says, these things became our examples. Our examples. God gave us these stories in the Old Testament so that we would know better, that we would not make the same mistakes that the people of Israel made. We do, but we don't have to. We can follow the example and not do those things. Did that make sense? Maybe we should say we should not follow their example and find ourselves on the right side of God's will. Be blessed. Think about this today. Follow him, and see you tonight for all the things happening at church. God bless.